firstchiefcwrt@gmail.com. And like I said, we have all the information, like our videos and many other field trips. And so what I'd like to do is start off with introduce Cooper Wingert, who he was here a few years ago. We have the privilege and had the honor of Cooper. At the age of 13, he gave his first Civil War talk about what happened in Harrisburg around there. So we're bringing Cooper back. So I'd like to give a warm welcome to Cooper, and we'll let you take it.
All right, can folks in the back hear me? Not too loud? All right, perfect. So as Ricky said, this was July 2011, and you all still met in Country Meadows, and you had a 13-year-old come up and talk for 35 minutes about the Civil War. And then, what is it? 13 years later, you've asked me to come back and give the same talk, and hopefully I have learned a few things more in those 13 years. As it works out, usually I tend to find a lot of the most interesting things after the book gets published. So I'm going to get to share with you all those interesting things I found too late for inclusion in the book. So I want to start with, first, my talk tonight, we're going to talk about the Gettysburg Campaign, but maybe in a way that you haven't heard about before, and looking at the northern third of the Confederate Army that continued up the Cumberland Valley, up what we now know as Route 11, towards Harrisburg. I want to start off by talking about Confederate strategy, Robert E. Lee. So we hear a lot about Robert E. Lee when we talk about the Gettysburg Campaign. We also hear a lot about what he was to do when he came north in Pennsylvania in June of 1863. But one of the things that I want to start off with is making the point that Lee really didn't have one single geographic target when he came to Pennsylvania. He didn't sit over a map with Longstreet like in the movie and point to Gettysburg and say, here are all the roads that lead here, this is where we're going. He actually was, well, one, he was very astute about northern politics. Lee was a general, but he was also, he had his pulse on the finger, his finger on the pulse of American politics. And he believed that he had an opportunity to break the will of the people to continue this. He understood that the North had more resources, more manpower, and that if the North had the resolve, they could eventually defeat the Confederates. Eventually, the Confederacy would simply run out of men, run out of supplies, would run out of food. So Lee was hoping to really get at the Republic and convince them that this war wasn't for fighting. This was nothing new. Lee had similar motivations when he came to Maryland in 1862. This is what he wrote to Jefferson Davis to explain why he was taking the Army of Northern Virginia into Maryland. Taking the war to Maryland would, quote, enable the people of the United States to determine at their coming elections whether they would support those who favor a prolongation of the war or those who wish to bring it to a termination. So as I said, Lee has his finger on the pulse of the Northern electorate. He's aware that there are midterm elections coming up. We all know what happens at Antietam. McClellan turns Lee back after a bloody battle on September 17th. And then, even though it's not necessarily a conclusive Union victory, President Lincoln uses the Battle of Antietam as the occasion to issue this Emancipation Proclamation on September 22nd. So things have changed by the summer of 1863, but Lee actually thinks they've changed to his advantage. He is convinced that by the summer of 1863, Northern morale is at an all-time low after the Emancipation Proclamation. Lee believes that most white Northerners aren't really committed to fighting for emancipation. And he believes that if now he carries the war into the North, forces Northerners to decide if this war is worth fighting, they'll decide it isn't worth fighting, especially if they're now fighting for black people. That's Lee's gambit that's coming forth in 1863. How are we doing with the microphones? Is there a little bit of echo? All good? Okay. So Lee recognized that there are a number of ways to accomplish his goal. His goal is not one geographic place, it's a political goal. It's about breaking the will of other people.
That's my fault.
You're good, Ricky. He could win a major battle, or he could threaten a major northern city or capital. Now, there's a couple of big northern cities in Pennsylvania. There's Philadelphia, but Philadelphia is way in the southeastern part of the state. And someone as astute as Robert E. Lee is not going to extend his supply line and his communication line all the way across Pennsylvania. That would be kind of saying, asking for trouble. There's Pittsburgh in the southwestern corner of the state, which actually what the War Department in Washington was convinced that Pittsburgh was Lee's target for most of early June 1863. They were convinced that Lee was going. And then there's Harrisburg, which is located right up the end of the Cumberland Valley along Route 11. It's the most accessible big city in Pennsylvania for Lee, the northern capital. And that's what Lee has in mind when on June 22nd he tells Ewell, the commander of the Second Corps, if Harrisburg comes within your means, capture it. So to be clear, I'm not saying that Lee came to Pennsylvania specifically to attack Harrisburg. He wanted to get at the will of the northern people. And I think for Lee, the easiest way to do that was by going after a northern capital like Harrisburg. So Confederate, rank and file Confederate soldiers were also eager about the invasion to the north, in part because they felt like most war had been fought in the South, and they wanted to bring the war to the northern people, make the northern people feel what it was like to have this war fought in their farm fields and their backyards, but also because of some long simmering tension over slavery. So Confederate soldiers blamed Pennsylvania as this underground railroad hotspot, particularly in the 1840s and 1850s. And as soon as they got into Pennsylvania, they started rounding up African Americans, free-born people from Pennsylvania, either selling them into slavery in Winchester, or a number of them ended up at Castle Thunder Prison in Richmond. They also attacked the homes of prominent abolitionists. So I have a couple of diary entries from Edward Allegheny Johnson's division, which was part of Ewell's Second Corps. They're marching eastward across along Route 30, Lincoln Highway, and they run across Caledonia Furnace. They burned Thaddeus Stevens, abolitionist congressman. He had an iron furnace in Caledonia. They burned it to the ground. And in their diaries, these rank and file Confederates are crowing about how they just burned that damned abolitionist property. So for some Confederate soldiers, this invasion was also a revenge for years of underground railroad activists. So on the other side of things, we have the Union response. And actually using the term Union strategy is a bit generous on my part. It was a bit chaotic. There really wasn't one unified strategy. So the governor of Pennsylvania is Andrew Curtin. And I mentioned earlier that Lee is very astute about northern politics. Curtin's up for re-election. Can you imagine a governor of a state being up for re-election and having the state be invaded? That doesn't look pretty good. So Curtin is already facing a tough battle for re-election. He'll end up winning narrowly by 5,000 votes. Back in the 19th century, Pennsylvania elected governors every 3 years, and in October, a month before the national election, November. So Curtin calls for 50,000 Pennsylvanians to come out and defend their state from a Confederate invasion. The problem is Curtin has a really bad relationship with Edward Stanton, who's Lincoln's Secretary of War in Washington. And this goes back to the summer 1862 when the federal government had been trying to ramp up recruitment. And Curtin recognized that Pennsylvanians were weary of, and that if you threw everything at them at once, they might back up. So Curtin was kind of slow pedaling the recruitment policy. And in Washington, the bureaucrats like Stanton, they saw Curtin as just an obstructionist. So there's this mutual distrust that kind of casts a shadow over everything. That Stanton and Curtin hated each other. And unfortunately, these are the two men who have to work together to save Pennsylvania. That becomes a problem. The one thing that the federal government does do to help out Pennsylvania is they create two military departments to defend the state. One based out of Pittsburgh, called the Department of the Monongahela, and another based here in Harrisburg called the Department of Susquehanna. And initially, the War Department in Washington is convinced that the Confederates are going after Pittsburgh. They are convinced that it is a cavalry raid targeted towards Pittsburgh. So they send all the supplies to Pittsburgh. And they leave the commander of this new department in Harrisburg, Darius Couch, with 250 men from the Invalid. That's it. That's how he's that is the force with which he's supposed to defend the state capital. It's not much. Couch was a veteran commander. He had been commander of the Army Potomac's Second Corps beforehand. But when he arrives in Harrisburg on June 11, 1863, he's not optimistic. The first thing he does is he tells Governor Curtin, "You better pack the state archives and move them to Philadelphia." Not exactly the ringing optimism from your new department commander. And then, and this is actually something new I found since I read the book, I found Couch's personal journal. And in his personal journal, he reveals what his backup plan was. And that was, he was already kind of basically admitted he couldn't defend Harrisburg. His backup plan was to retire from Harrisburg to the northeast to defend the coal fields. He was going to retreat back into the mountains with whatever force he could gather and defend the coal fields. And that's what I've learned is how important the Pennsylvania coal country was to the Union Navy. In fact, I was going through Governor Curtin's papers a couple years ago in the state archives. One of the really interesting letters that just popped out at me was Gideon Welles, Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of the Navy, the guy who kind of looks like a figure out of Greek mythology. Gideon Welles writes a letter to Governor Curtin on June 30th, telling Curtin, whatever happens in Pennsylvania, you better not lose Pennsylvania coal country, because the Union's Navy blockade of the South cannot sustain itself without Pennsylvania coal. That's part of the reason why there's a quote from Stonewall Jackson, mapmaker, and Stonewall Jackson had been obsessed with Pennsylvania's coal country for some time before his death. So one of the big strategic considerations, not just protecting Harrisburg, but protecting coal mines that supply the Union Navy. So Couch is already thinking, we're probably going to lose Harrisburg. We better just do everything we can to keep the Confederates out of coal country. But Couch does, of course, have to make an effort to defend Harrisburg. It would look pretty bad if you just packed up and gave the capital to the Confederates. So when he arrives in Harrisburg, he looks across the Susquehanna River. This photograph is taken around the turn of the 20th century from what we now know as City Island. Back then it was known as Forster's Island. And Couch looks across. This is the Camelback Bridge, the covered bridge that was the predecessor to the Market Street Bridge. And he sees this big hill over here, Hummel's Heights, Bridgeport Heights, or this alternatively known as. This is essentially modern day Des Moines. Dockside Road is right there now. It was just some placement. And Couch realizes immediately that the Susquehanna River is only 8/10 of a mile wide at this point, and that if the Confederates gain this hill, they can easily shell Harrisburg to ruins. The range of the Napoleon cannon is close to 1.5 to 2 miles, so they're easily within range of this. So basically, to hold Harrisburg, you have to hold the western shore and those heights of the western shore. That's what Couch realizes. So they start construction on a series of routes. The first is called Fort Washington. It's a engraving from Frank Leslie's Australian newspaper, which would suggest that it's a bunch of patriotic citizens from Harrisburg who built the fort. That's who started out building it, but they got tired after about 9 hours. It's actually an impressed African Americans who built those. And this is a view once the fort was completed. This is in June 63. You can see the Camelback Bridge. We now know as City Island, the Capitol building, the original one before the 1897 fire. Another view which is taken slightly further to the northeast. You can see the mountain ranges in the background. You can see, again, City Island, more of Harrisburg, the Capitol on the right. And you can see a soldier posing here. And this is taken facing away from the river towards what we would now is now kind of the Des Moines bottleneck of Route 11. Showing that there were camps all the way down the other side. And hopefully giving away the visual here. This gives you a visual. Here's Harrisburg, Camelback Bridge. Fort Washington is built right here to defend this part. But there's a problem, which is, it's not built on the highest part of the hill. So a couple days later, Union engineers have to go out about a quarter of a mile and build a second fort, which they named appropriately Fort Couch, after General Couch. So Harrisburg's defenses consist of Fort Couch, which defends Fort Washington, which in turn defends Harrisburg. You imagine why people in Harrisburg were worried. And Fort Couch, I think many of you know, still stands today. It was actually kind of turned into a garbage dump for decades until a group of Civic Club, I think in the 50s, cleaned it up. And there's a monument put there by Camp Curtin Historical Society in 2005. The original earthworks are still there. And this this is just I like to include. This is something I found after the book. This is a soldier's letter of his own, where he drew a map of the fort and a letter back home. You can see the Cumberland Valley Railroad Bridge, the Camelback Bridge, Harrisburg. I'm not sure if his commanding officer would have been happy that he was drawing detailed maps on letters that could have been intercepted. But his map really, one of the fun things to illustrate. You see these lines he drew here? That was because if you've ever been to Nagley Park or these heights in Lemoyne, now that Nagley Park is now part of it, it's a pretty severe slope. So one of the things soldiers complained about is at night they would start to slide down the hill in their sleep. So a couple of soldiers would take stakes and plant them at their feet to prevent them from sliding down at night. So that's why he's illustrating that in his letter as a complaint back to family and friends. So back to the Confederate side. So we've talked about the lackluster Union response, which is kind of just very chaotic and very slapdash. In the meantime, the Confederate army is fast approaching, and ahead of, at the vanguard of Robert E. Lee's army is the cavalry brigade under Brigadier General Gallatin Jenkins. We were talking a little bit about Jenkins beforehand. Jenkins had been a U.S. congressman, then he became a Confederate congressman. Once the South seceded, he was from Western Virginia. And if you wanted somebody out of the Confederate Congress, what you did is you made them a brigadier general. So Jenkins becomes a brigadier general with really no military experience. And he's not highly regarded within the Army of Northern Virginia. In fact, this is his first campaign with the Army of Northern Virginia in the Gettysburg Campaign. He's not with it. He's been kind of doing his own thing in Western Virginia under Samuel R. Jones. And as you see, he has some clashes with the Army of Virginia's kind of established hierarchy. The man he is leading through the Cumberland Valley is this man, Richard S. Ewell, commander of about a third of Robert E. Lee's Second Corps, the kind of successor to Stonewall Jackson. And he brings with him Allegheny Johnson's divisions and Robert Rowe's divisions, approximately 15,000 infantry. They're coming from Shippensburg all the way to Carlisle. They reach Shippensburg on June 24th and Carlisle on June 27th. So then, after reaching Carlisle, Ewell, sends Jenkins to Mechanicsburg, about halfway in between Harrisburg and Carlisle. And Jenkins, with his 1,200 cavalry, is supposed to reconnoiter the defenses of Harrisburg to find out if Harrisburg is in fact within, is it vulnerable as Ewell and Lee think it is. So in the meantime, as Ewell and Jenkins have been slowly creeping up the Cumberland Valley, the Union Army is belatedly organizing the defenses. So I mentioned that there's this poor relationship between Governor Curtin and Edwin Stanton. The one thing Stanton does kind of throw Curtin a bone at one point, and he contacts the governor of New York, a Democrat named Horatio Seymour, and Seymour agrees to send New York's National Guard from New York by boat to Pennsylvania. By boat to Philadelphia, then train to Harrisburg, to Pennsylvania to assist in the defense of Harrisburg. So actually, the majority of militia who are on hand to defend Harrisburg in late June 1863 are from New York. Pennsylvania's call, partly because some of the internal politics, Pennsylvania's Governor Curtin really doesn't get an overwhelming response from Pennsylvanians until after June 6th. This is partly his own fault. Curtin had asked in his initial proclamation calling for 50,000 volunteers, he asked for them to serve, quote, for the emergency. What does that mean? A lot of people were reluctant to volunteer because is the emergency going to be construed to be the whole war? A lot of Pennsylvanians wanted to fight to defend Pennsylvania, but they didn't necessarily want to join the war in Virginia or be sent out into Western theater. And Curtin was kind of stubborn about that language until the very end. Curtin was really kind of scared of Edwin Stanton. He didn't want to upset Stanton, and he worried that if he made a call for militia to serve a short period of time, it might compromise the draft. Remember that the Congress had passed the Enrollment Act in March 1863, a new draft. That's why we have the draft ride spreading out in New York City right after Gettysburg. And Curtin was worried that if he gobble up a bunch of Pennsylvania men into the militia. That would undercut Stanton's efforts to draft men in Pennsylvania. But finally, Curtin just decides he's going to have to step on Stanton's toes. And on June 26th, Curtin issues a second proclamation, in which he basically begs for anyone to come and defend the state, and he said, I'll accept you for 60 to 90 days. So that's kind of how the defense of Harrisburg comes to be. By the time the Confederates are on the doorstep of Harrisburg, there's only about anywhere from 10,000-ish militia in the Harrisburg area. And I say 10,000-ish because we have a number of New York regiments, and we have a bunch of Pennsylvanians over in Camp Curtin here. But to give you an idea, they're just getting organized. They're literally arriving in Harrisburg, being thrown into companies. Many of them aren't even trained how to shoot, and then sent off across the Camelback Bridge to the forts. So the effective fighting force between the militia that Caltrans assembled in Harrisburg and Ewell's infantry in Carlisle might be somewhat comparable in numbers, but in experience, it's not even close. It's very clear that the militia who are assembled here are raw, they're untrained, and very few people are expecting they're going to be able to hold up against Stonewall Jackson's former. So on the morning of June 28th, things start to get a little bit closer to Harrisburg. On June 28th, Jenkins' brigade occupies Mechanicsburg without really much of a fight. They spread out on both the Trindle Road and Carlisle Pike, which are still there, still the same names. And really, as I said, Jenkins' job is to reconnoiter Harrisburg's defenses and figure out if, in fact, Harrisburg is takeable. If Ewell's infantry is 12,000 to 15,000 infantry, Carlisle can capture the Pennsylvania capital. And really, throughout June 28th and June 29th, fighting centers around Oyster Point. Back in the 19th century, the Trindle Road and Carlisle Pike came to an intersection right here, where there was a hotel owned by the Oyster family called the Oyster Point Hotel. It was demolished, I think, in the 1960s. And this is really where fighting centers ground. Jenkins has skirmishers posted in Peachburg at the Samuel Albright House, and he forms a kind of park like this. The Union and militia are concentrated in and around Oyster Point. And for most of June 28th, they're just kind of feeling each other out, skirmishing. Jenkins retires back to the Peachburg later that evening. And he has a conflict of war with some of his subordinates. And one of the things that Jenkins wants to do is he wants to ride south from the Peach Church along what's now St. John's Church Road up to Slate Hill. Slate Hill is now a bunch of developments for the most part, but at the time it was a great viewpoint because close to 4 miles he could view the defense of Harrisburg. And in this he got a little bit of help from Union engineers because Union engineers who were constructing the forts were petrified about what if there's an attack on the fort and the Confederates hide behind trees as they're attacking us. So they cut down every single tree on these heights, meaning that from 4 miles away, Jenkins could observe the defenses in detail with his field glasses. So Jenkins needs a diversion in order to be able to do this. So the next day, he tasked Lieutenant Colonel Vincent Witcher of the 34th Virginia Cavalry Battalion with making a charge straight down the Carlisle Pike through a bunch of Union skirmishers that ends here at Rhinefeld Lane, which is now modern-day 28th Street. This is significant because this is the closest the Confederates ever get in a line as the bird flies to Harrisburg. They'll get further north, they'll get further east, as Scott Mangus can tell you, but they don't get closer to Harrisburg than they do here on what's now modern-day 28th Street. And then you have an idea of this skirmish. Witcher later described that General Jenkins ordered me to simply demonstrate what he was gone with General Lee's engineers. But finding the position could be carried, I made a successful direct assault. So really, it's kind of laughable. It's only 50 Confederates led by Witcher who drive back several hundred Union skirmishers. They take position at Rhinefeld Lane, and here's an account from a diary of a Pennsylvania militiaman. They, the Confederates, were not more than a half-mile off, so we could see the men distinctly at the Oyster Point Tavern. Hear every musket shot or volley of muskets. Some of our regiment were in the engagement, and all of us expected to be. And one of my favorite accounts is this from a civilian named Zacchaeus Bowman. His house actually still stands in Camp Hill, the corner of 26th and Market. And he's up in his attic, And we could see them. They were at the toll gate between 1 and 2 hours. While we were in the garret, we heard the bullets against the house. Now, of course, this is a minor engagement as far as the skirmish. But of course, residents of Camp Hill like to profit off of it. So in 1907, there was this dramatic poster claiming that Camp Hill was the real high-water mark of the Civil War. They had a depiction of Jenkins, though this is the short beard Jenkins. They didn't have the accurate beard was belt-length by the Gettysburg Campaign. And also, this is incorrect, because Jenkins was not actually at Oyster Point. The whole point of the skirmish was a diversion so he could go elsewhere with lead engineers and scout the events of Harrisburg. They have the Tollgate House. This is one of my favorites. This is titled "Can't Make Them Back: House Struck by a Confederate Shell." Now, I lined this up, and I am reasonably confident this photo is taken facing westward, which would indicate that it was a Union cannon that misfired and hit a house. And in fact, we have an account of a Union artillery outfit from Philadelphia misfiring and hitting a house. But they thought they could do that one over us. This is more of an example of Union militia's incompetency than it is a Confederate, the wrath of the Confederate Army. And then this is the lane, again, this is kind of dramatic language. This lane stood the farthest north Confederate fighting line stood, isn't actually true. It's the closest to Harrisburg, not the farthest north. You can actually see this lane has not changed much. Oops, there you go. See?
Yeah.
This is 28th Street in Camp Hill. It's one way. You have to go down. You're between Market Street. You have to go down that way. At least that's the way I've been going down. So unless something goes the wrong way, I'm one way. But it's pretty empty. But you get a sense of this is just. So the whole skirmish of Oyster Point is important because it gives Jenkins time, while all this is going on here, to ride south to Slate Hill. And while he's there, this is about noonish on June 29th, he likes what he sees. He and the engineers who come with him, I think H.B. Richardson is one of the engineers who accompanies him. Basically, to put it politely, they think the Union defenses are laughing stock. They report back to Ewell and Carlisle that Harrisburg is absolutely fair game. This can be taken. Here's where the timeline is really. This is early afternoon, June 29th. We know that Ewell orders his soldiers to strike their tents and get ready to march for Harrisburg because we have diary entries from some of Ewell's soldiers at Carlisle Barracks, throughout Carlisle, on the Dickinson College campus, who talk about receiving orders on the afternoon of June 29th to march for Harrisburg. Those orders are a result of this reconnaissance. Then what happens? Someone who's seen the movie Gettysburg. We have Harrison, and the information that reaches Robert E. Lee. So Robert E. Lee learns, basically, regardless of the timeline on Harrison, always debatable, Robert E. Lee learns by June 28th and 29th that the Army of the Potomac is a heck of a lot closer than he thought it was. So he orders all his corps spread out across southern Pennsylvania to concentrate in the Gettysburg Campaign area. Those orders reach Ewell right after he's issued his marching orders for Harrisburg. So he quickly countermands those orders, tells the soldiers to stay put. And instead of marching to Harrisburg, Ewell prepares a different march south along Route 34 early the next morning on June 30th to Gettysburg. And we know what happens there. So I just want to emphasize it was that close to a major chunk, almost a third of the Confederate Army, marching towards Harrisburg. That's how close it comes. Here is herein lies the rub. So that should be the end of the story, right? But I remember I mentioned way back at the beginning of the talk that General Jenkins was not a regular part of the Army of Northern Virginia's command machinery. He was kind of a visitor, just kind of a guest, an interloper, they would have considered him. And Jenkins, nobody tells Jenkins about this. It's hard to believe. Part of it was that Ewell and Rhodes and Jenkins did not have a good relationship. They had several kind of confrontations along the way up from Virginia. But I think part of it is just the hurrying and confusion to march to Gettysburg. You'll simply forget. And then a couple of reasons why we determined one is Jenkins just waits here. He basically parks himself on the other side of Silver Spring Creek and waits. And years ago, I went to the state archives and I looked at border claims. These were after the Civil War, the state of Pennsylvania allowed local residents whose property was damaged during the Gettysburg Campaign to file claims for compensation. We can use those claims. When you match those claims up with a map, you can see where the Confederates were. So we know June 28th, June 29th, they stuck pretty close. So June 30th, they're everywhere. Jenkins men are here, all over. Which tells you, if you were a cavalry commander, you were about to leave, when you have your men miles apart, you were about to manage a withdrawal, you're about to pick up and hurry days? Probably not. Jenkins is waiting over here around Silver Spring Creek. He's allowing his men to forage freely because he's expecting Richard Ewell's Second Corps to come up the Carlisle pike and attack Harrisburg. He thinks his guys are getting the day off on June 3rd. But, much to his surprise, the Union Army knows something that Jenkins doesn't. A couple civilians managed to get through the Confederate lines from Carlisle to Harrisburg. And early in the morning of June 30th, they tip off Couch in Harrisburg that, in fact, the Confederates are leaving Carlisle. So Couch orders a brigade under this man, John Ewell, who his military experience pretty much consisted of parading down the streets of Brooklyn. He was a long-time New York National Guard general, but he had never seen combat. He was the president of the whole company. So he leads this brigade, and it takes them, to give you an idea of how kind of raw his generalship and his recruits are. They're marching from Fort Washington to Sporting Hill, which is about 4.5, 5 miles. They start around 10 a.m. I think they get there around 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It takes them a while. And they counter-march a bunch of times. They go out here, then they turn around, they come back. They're still ready to kill because they've been counter-marching all day. But around 3:30ish, they arrive at Sporting Hill, and they encounter Jenkins' rear guard. And the rear guard is, again, led by Lieutenant Colonel Wish, the commander of the 34th Virginia Cavalry. So if this still works, it's something I might have done in my very first talk, these moving maps, to see if it works. Okay, they're not moving, so I'll just have to explain. So basically what happens is the Union column, 1,200 men or John Ewell are marching down the Carlisle pike. They get ambushed by these 50 Confederates, rear guard skirmishers who are in the barn, most evident. The base of this barn still stands. If you look at the butt and overpasses they're passing, you'll see it. They get ambushed. They blatantly deploy on the other side of the Carlisle pike. That's Lieutenant Colonel Wicher. And really, the engagement becomes a standstill for a good hour or two, where about 250 Confederates in total here and up at the top, which is obscured by the Zoom bar, are managed to pull out a Union brigade of 1,200 militia. It's a pretty remarkable stance. What we know is the Battle of Sporting Hill. This is the northernmost engagement of Gettysburg Campaign, slightly further north than Oyster Point. And Ewell's militia advance, they're pinned down under this fire, and really what changes the tide of the battle is eventually the other militia back in Fort Washington start to hear a lot of gunfire, and they think maybe something's going on. So they send an artillery battalion, Landis Philadelphia Artillery, out to Sporting Hill. And things don't really go well first, because the artillerymen, they're a little nervous, it's their first battle. They start to load the charge fuse first, which is, Joe just said it. It'll blow up in your face, literally. Actually, there was an artillery lieutenant named Rufus King Jr. He actually wins the Medal of Honor for bravery at White Oak Swamp a year to the day previous, 1862. He was the son of a Union general. He happens to be on the scene, thank God, and he tells them, "You're going to kill yourself." He gives them a quick lesson on the battlefield on how to load a cannon. And when you know, if their first shot hit the barn square in the center, likely killing about a dozen Confederates. So the Battle of Spring Hill wraps up pretty shortly after. There's about a 30-minute artillery duel after this. But the Confederates, under which they retreat, they rejoin Jenkins' brigade, and they go to Carlisle, and then on July 1st, they eventually wind their way to Gettysburg on July 2nd. They arrive late on the battlefield. So the Sporting Hill engagement, one of the things that's interesting about it is, as far as we can tell, Jenkins and Richard believed they were facing Couch's entire groups. Richard later claimed in a letter in 1906 that he had held off the entire department of the Spaghetti. But this was a rearguard action pretty much because Jenkins was caught off guard. He didn't realize that Ewell was headed towards Gettysburg. So he needed time to gather in all his detachments that had been out foraging throughout eastern Cumberland County. So even though that was something held, the Union Army won the battlefield, you could argue that the Confederates won maybe a strategic victory, in the fact that they were able to stave off the Union column enough to buy time to do something of somewhat of an early retreat back to Carlisle. Speaking of Carlisle, again, the story should be over, right? Confederates are out of Cumberland County. Well, this guy has been floating about for a while. Jeb Stuart, not exactly the one who follows orders. He was supposed to ride through the Union Army. He found he couldn't do that, so instead he rode around them. And thus very famously placing himself out of communication with Robert Lee's main army in Northern Virginia for most of the Gettysburg Campaign. So Stuart is coming through York County on July 1st, and he heads to Carlisle because why? He expects to find Richard Ewell there. So confident is Jeb Stuart that he's going to find Richard Ewell in Carlisle, he rides into town himself. So if you ever approach Carlisle from the east, near where Scales Restaurant used to be, if that's familiar to anybody, he's riding down Trindle Road into Carlisle. He sees a bunch of gray uniforms and he thinks, great, I found Ewell's men. And then he sees the Union flag and he thinks, oh God, and he quickly turns and gets out of there. Some of the Pennsylvania militia wore gray uniforms before the war. So Stuart almost gets captured right before the shot of Carlisle. So Stuart's back. He doesn't know why there are Union militia in Carlisle. These are some of the same troops who fought at Sporting Hill. They've continued on to Carlisle. They've been reinforced by other New York and Pennsylvania units. About 3,000 or so militia in Carlisle under the command of a general named William F. Baldy Smith. And Stuart is with Robert E. Lee's nephew, Fitzhugh Lee. He's one of the brigade commanders under Stuart of cavalry. And Fitzhugh actually had served at Carlisle Barracks before the war. In fact, he had girlfriends in Carlisle, which must have been awkward now that he was about to attack the town. And this is the famous illustration that ends up, I believe it's in Harper's Weekly. So Carlisle residents had packed the square of Carlisle celebrating what they thought was their town's liberation from Confederates. They have these Union militia arriving, and all of a sudden they see puffs of smoke to the east. Well, the Confederates had been approaching from the west. They didn't realize that Stuart's column had wrapped around from the east. The east was the last place they were expecting to see a bunch of Confederates here. And this began the shelling of Carlisle. The Confederates line from the east, Fitzhugh Lee's brigade, they have cannons on the eastern side, and they start shelling the town of Carlisle. And Stuart requests 3 times for the surrender of Carlisle. Baldy Smith famously tells them to shell away, and the Union forces hold Carlisle. And part of this was because of the sheer exhaustion of Stuart's men. They had been riding for weeks. They were just dead tired. There's an account from one of the artillerymen that one of Stuart's troopers was so tired he fell fast asleep right next to a booming cannon. That was just going on and on and on. So the Confederate cavalry were exhausted. They were dead tired. And by about 3 in the morning, they fired their last shots and they pack up. They head back down to what we now know as 74 to Dillsburg and then pivot towards Gettysburg, where Stuart eventually arrives on July 2nd and gets talking to, we assume, from Robert E. Lee, who beats late. Before they leave, however, the Confederates go over here to Carlisle Barracks and they burn the barracks. So it's not Ewell who burns the barracks. His men actually were enjoying living in the barracks. It's Jeb Stuart's cavalry on July 1st, July 2nd, who burn Carlisle Barracks. So I think I'm close to time. I'll wrap up with this. So this is you can't listen to talk, but it's Citizens of the Cumberland Valley. This is a poster that was posted in Carlisle the day after the shelling of Carlisle. And it's urging residents of the Cumberland Valley, fellow citizens, rise armed. And it's talking about how the Confederates have come here. They've shelled the town with innocent women and children. And I think I wanted to end on this because I started by talking about how Robert E. Lee believed by coming north into Pennsylvania, he could break the will of the northern people to continue the war. I actually want to end by saying I think Lee's fatal error was maybe not ordering this. Maybe he was also ordering this the central assault on July 3rd. We can debate that. But I think one of his errors during the Gettysburg Campaign was underestimating the threat and resolve of the Northern people. When he had encountered Northern armies at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, they broke. That's for sure. But I think he underestimated the power of invading them. And he thought the Northern people would buckle. He thought residents of Pennsylvania, the Union Army would just give in. They didn't. I think he overestimated how unpopular the Emancipation Proclamation was. And I think that's part of the lesson of the Gettysburg Campaign. Instead of just rolling over, citizens of Carlisle were outraged. They wanted to volunteer after the shelling of Carlisle. So I'll leave you with that, and I want to thank you all for listening to me tonight, and I look forward to a good question and answer session.
Cooper, one great job like you did for 13 years.
Thank you.
We tend to visualize Harrisburg because of the Dawson Creek Dam, that it was a deep river, and of course it was, and especially in Union law. And was it envisioned by Curtin to burn the Camelback Bridge?
So I never found like a smoking gun per se where Curtin had an arrangement for it to be burned. There are a number of newspaper accounts in Harrisburg from like the 1880s and beyond that kind of claim that was part of the plan. But to your point about the plan of river, it was very long time. There's a great source of recollections by residents of what we now know as Camp Hill, that was called Whitehall, and a number of them argued that the river was shallow enough that the Confederates probably could afford it. Still, I think it would have been a lot more difficult than part of just getting supplies over. I think for the Confederates, they were never going to take and pull Harrisburg. I think what they wanted was kind of a photo op of the Confederate flag over the charred ruins in Pennsylvania State Capitol, something like that, as just the kind of
Propaganda.
The propaganda. Just they wanted that on the cover of Harper's Weekly, and they would make it really hard for Curtin running for re-election, and make it very hard for the Lincoln administration to argue they were winning the war. So I think it really was less about how they got there, and they might have sent a part. If they had gotten to Harrisburg and the bridge had been burned, I could imagine them sending a small party of cavalry over, not that they would not take a selfie, but proverbially just kind of, here we are, we've marked our territory, and then make their point and leave. That's a good point about the river,
Slade Hill, or the folks that don't realize, Slade Hill is the hill that's above Camp Hill Prison.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
Big church on top of it.
and even today where the church is,
Christian Life Assembly, I think.
Yeah.
Okay.
used to this day, you can see the trees and everything. Harrisburg among them.
Yeah, it's a great day.
It
Certainly.
It captured the Pikesville and Columbia Bridge. Would Gettysburg have happened, or would we have crossed there and then up there?
That's a good question. I honestly think Scott Jenkins would be the one most qualified to answer that. My answer would be so. And this is me leaning Scott first, just to be clear that he's the one who did this research. One of the things Scott found was that Jubal Early kind of wrote his own orders. It shouldn't be surprising if you study Jubal Early. Jewel Early wasn't orders to cross the bridge and then turn on towards Harrisburg. That was Jewel Early kind of winging it. So I don't know. I think Jewel Early certainly would have made it a ruckus Lancaster, but again, it's the same problem of the further east you go, at least in my opinion, you're overextending your supply and communication line. It's very easy to get cut off. I'm not sure that Lee would have sent the whole army across the Susquehanna River there. It's an intriguing question. I don't know. I think Scott had more of an opinion on that than I would.
Okay. Go to the October field trip with us. You'll get all the right answers.
Yes, sir.
Excellent presentation. What was Meade's plans for Harrisburg?
Meade?
Yeah.
So it's a good question. I don't think Meade really thought about Harrisburg until after the Battle of Gettysburg, during and after the Battle of Gettysburg. So Meade, well, one, he assumes command on June 28th. So by that point, there's not much he can do to help Harrisburg. if the Confederates are already there, it's up to the militia and scouts to defend Harrisburg. After Gettysburg is where it actually gets interesting. So after Gettysburg, or during Gettysburg, actually, Meade is kind of welcoming Couch to come down in the Confederate spirit. You can imagine the Confederates are north of Gettysburg, Meade south of Gettysburg. Couch started sending militia to Carlisle. That's part of this movement. They're probably not going to make a difference in the battle, but if Lee already knows he has 10 to 15,000 new militia in his rear, he's going to have to do something about it. He's going to have to divert some forces. And where it really comes into play is Meade tries to rush out to send the militia down in front of the valley to help cut off Lee as Lee's making his way westward through Monterey Pass, through Adams and Franklin County. And the long and the short answer, I don't really need to spoil it for you, is they don't get there fast enough. They're really slow. There's a torrential rain downpour on July 4th as the militia are trying to cross Mount Holly, and they literally get bogged down in mud. So I think for me, Harrisburg is, we could get these men fast enough. Lincoln is the one actually has more opinions. Lincoln has an absolute connection at Lorenzo Thomas, who's the Army's adjutant general, who's actually in Harrisburg coordinating the militia after June 30th. And he tells Lorenzo Thomas, one of Lincoln's kind of snippier remarks, he tells him that you're more likely to catch the man in the moon than any part of Lee's army at the rate you're going. So I think that's the role that they play.
Cooper, I found your discussion about the Pennsylvania Cold is interesting. In Jackson, I guess. What was their intent if they were going to hold it, destroy it? And you can't hold that amount of space that far north. Did your research found anything what they intended to do?
Yeah, it's a good question. So it's murky. Most of what I'm going on with is Jedediah Hotchkiss. He was the map maker, and he recorded conversations with Stonewall Jackson before his death. So Jackson kind of, and I phrase it. We know that for Union authorities, it was a top priority. It was a top priority for Couch. It was a top priority for the Secretary of Navy, getting Wells. I'm not sure how serious the Confederates were, but we do know that Stonewall Jackson had been musing about, what if I set a fire in the Pennsylvania coal field? Like, I could really screw them up. So I think it was more of a sabotage. They were obviously opinion holding it, but I think they thought they'd get up there and they could do some sabotage, which again probably would not involve the whole Confederate army there. It would probably involve a cavalry raid, some kind of strike. Even if they could disrupt the flow of coal of the Union Navy, then they could maybe disrupt the Union blockade, and that would have a ripple effect. So I think that's the hope, but it's murky. One of the big things that I think happens, and this is part of the problem, kind of figuring out what Lee was thinking. I think special orders, what was it, 92 in the Maryland campaign, I think that freaked Lee out. So I don't think he put much in writing after that, which is why there's still, why you can write so many books about what Lee was going to do during Gettysburg. But he never himself up. Any other questions?
Just quick, at Sarah's Gap, anything where they were trying to get up there to look at the coals? That's what happened at Sarah's Gap?
So Stairs Gap didn't have really anything to do with the coal. Stairs Gap was, so for those of you, it's basically you follow Route 34 straight north from Carlisle, that's Stairs Gap. And at the base of the gap, there's a big boulder, the old style Pennsylvania Historical Museum Commission markers, that commemorates a group of Confederate cavalry who got to the base of the gap. And basically, these were a couple of Confederate cavalrymen who were just reconnoitering. They never got to the top of the mountain, the gap. There were a bunch of returned 9-month soldiers from Perry County who were up there. So it was more of just a reconnaissance mission.
Okay.
So there are many high water marks in the Gettysburg Campaign. You have the farthest east in Wrightsville. You have the farthest towards Harrisburg at Oyster Point, the farthest north Battle in Sporting Hill, and the farthest north Reach that we know of will be Stead's Gap. So if you can keep those straight, they're high water marks. Yeah, gentlemen in the back there.
Really more, we were not really for any military reason, but other than to hopefully break the North back, and I think they really didn't look at it war. But then you said that they told you it's not to take Harrisburg. Did they have no military value? Why would they need to take that?
I think for Lee, the value of taking up the capital like Harrisburg would be political. That, as I mentioned earlier, imagine if you're a northern reader in New York, Connecticut, or Ohio, who's kind of iffy about the war and not sure if you're going to vote for in the next election. If you see the Pennsylvania state capitol in smoldering ruins of it on the plaster on the front page of Harper's Weekly, you might think, wow, the war effort's going to bad. So I think his goal was just to convince the northern public that this war was going to be long, nasty. It was going to be just too much of a sacrifice to win. And I think for him, like I said, doesn't have one set geographic target, but Harrisburg is one of the best ways to really shake the northern public's confidence. Philadelphia would have been great too, but I think that's too far to reach for Lee. I think he knows that. Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, and what you said about Pittsburgh, it made no sense. I can see where
yeah.
Because Pittsburgh was Jim Marlin's.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I can see where they would have stuck troops out there. I understand that, so it makes sense. Yeah.
We have time for a couple more?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Gentlemen here.
I live near a place called Signal.
Oh, yes.
It's 81. Now, was that Confederate on top of there?
So the real answer is I don't know. So Signal Hill has been passed down in kind of local oral history for generations, I guess. It was a signal station. And certainly for the development, it was probably the highest peak in the Harrisburg area. And it was.
Yeah, I think they took like 20 to 30 feet off that when they put it.
Yeah. So it certainly would have offered a great view. I was thinking of the state capitol. From what I understand, there's some talk about a Union signal station that communicated between there and Fort Washington or General Hall. But to be honest, I've never been able to. I think Wilbur Nye's here in the Rebels might mention it, but I've never been able to track down the rest of the documentation. But it's one of those things that, one, it makes logical sense, and two, there's so much of the oral history, I'm inclined to believe it, but I can't provide you with smoke gun, unfortunately. If I ever find it, I'll let you know. But,
Great.
From a tactical standpoint, Harrisburg, they could have disrupted or destroyed Camp Curtin, the largest, base for recruits in the Union Army, and also the railroad.
Yeah.
And most of the railroads came into Harrisburg, not on the west shore, but on the east shore, most of them. Of course, it was the Tennessee and whatever, but so disrupt the recruit training and maybe disrupt some of the rail traffic and then withdraw.
Yeah, I think really what they're hoping to do, like you're saying, is make trouble, do as much damage as quickly as possible and then get out of Dodge City before sundown. There weren't actually that many trips at Camp Curtin during the summer of '63. I heard the captain's problem, and it was just barren. It was one of the few times where the war in Camp Curtin was actually deserted. But you're right. In normal times, Camp Curtin was really convenient because it had all those rail lines where troops could get trained there and then whisked off to D.C. or to Baltimore or out west of Pittsburgh and into the western theater. So, even just taking out a few of those railroad bridges would have taken months to rebuild and would have really gotten out the works. So that's good. There was, yeah.
I misunderstood one thing you said.
Mhm.
The furthest north point the Confederate Army came, I have read it was Camp Hill. You disagree or agree?
So, okay, so there's the furthest towards Harrisburg is Camp Hill. So that's not the furthest north, it's not the furthest east either. That's Limekiln Lane, 28th Street, Camp Hill. That's like the widest the furthest. The crow flies to Harrisburg. It's 2 miles or so. The furthest north engagement is Sporting Hill. I think I can show you. Sporting Hill is like, when I say slightly, I mean slightly further north than Oyster Point. So here's Limekiln Lane, here's Sporting Hill. So like it's, pretty close, but in terms of engagement, Sporting Hill is kind of here. That's the state marker.
Okay.
The state marker, providing Sporting Hill being the northernmost and actually one of the veterans was the first to point that in order to engage. It was a corporal at Sporting Hill, later goes on down the NRA. He's the one who writes one of the first history of Sporting Hill. And then the furthest north we know of any Confederate soldiers was Ferris Gap. So that's not our furthest north engagement. That's just the furthest north that we know a couple of organized Confederates wandered. But honestly, we can't know for sure that's the furthest north. And in fact, I have suspicion that it isn't. But that's what the furthest north we've confirmed. Does that make sense? All right. Well, thank you so much, and I appreciate it.
Thank you, sir. An excellent presentation. So, let's give Cooper another thank you.
Yeah, okay, like, we'll put you in the front of the book. Also, we do have some books in the back that are for sale. And like I said, we do have flyers and brochures for the field trips. And again, I'll bring it, anybody who wants to put their name on the email list, please let me know. I'll bring it to you so you can fill it out. If not, like I say, next month, not a year, we have Bob O'Connor talking about the Confederate slide and the Legion Conspirator. You'll be here this time next month. So thank you all very much. Have a good evening. And thank you to Cooper for less than 13 years for the next trip.
Thank you.